Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 22nd webinar in IWFM's Turbulent Time series, which focuses on the draft Building Safety Bill and the new statutory role of the Building Safety Manager. My name is Sophie Hooper. I'm the Head of Policy at IWFM, and I will be your host for today. So far in this series, we've explored different aspects of the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic has been having on the workplace and facilities management arena. And today we will discuss the new building regime, which may have gone a little bit unnoticed, but will have most definitely a big impact on our wider sector. So since the Grenfell tragedy, we've been working to help build a new building safety regime. And there have been three big drivers for us to engage with all the policy in this area over the last 28 months already. One, to embed safety for safe home and wider spaces for people. Two, to help drive a culture change that would help create a better FM working environment through professionalizing the roles and through the maintenance of a golden thread of information throughout the life cycle of a building. And three, because the building safety manager would be the first statutory role in the FM space. Now, the publication of this draft bill is kind of confirming at high level the direction building safety is going to go, and therefore it was high time for us to do another webinar on this topic. I am joined by two fabulous guests, and I've had the pleasure of working with both of them over the last 3 years already. And together we'll explore some key areas so that listeners will walk away with greater insight really on what's coming down the line. And before I let the panel introduce itself, I just quickly want to have a look at the agenda for today because we've got quite a lot on it. So first, I will be talking through some slides on the building safety bill, and the slides will be available afterwards. And indeed, the entire recording will be available afterwards. I'll briefly be referencing the competence framework that will outline what competence criteria we will be expecting of the building safety manager in the future and what you can do to prepare for the regime coming into play. And then my two guests will provide their perspective on the new regime and how they're handling it. So before, I just want to let the panel introduce themselves now. Wayne, if you could please go.
Hi everybody, my name is Wayne Ward. I am a member of the Life Safety Working Group with IWFM. I'm originally a building surveyor, although I was a commercial director with BRE for 9 years, so I have experience of both the technical side of project delivery and the implementation of legislation. I was also a member of the working groups 9 and 10, which are project management and site supervision. So, and I've been involved in this I suppose this legislative development since its inception, so I have a full understanding of where it's come from and how it's got to the stage it's at.
Adam.
Thank you, Sophie, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Adam Gilbert. I am the Operations Director for Promise, which is a facilities management company, subsidiary of Knight Frank LLP. We manage residential and commercial buildings across the UK with a portfolio of about 600 properties. My background is health and safety. I've been involved in that arena for the last 20 years, and for the last couple of years I've been on one of the working groups that is looking at the competency of the building safety manager. So I've been involved in that since the Grenfell tragedy, and trying to look at how fire safety will change and be shaped in the aftermath of that. Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you both. And before we go into the detail of the draft building legislation, I thought it would be useful to give a brief overview of kind of the content where we've gotten to, because that draft bill is already the result of a series of activities and policy developments following those very tragic events in 2017. And a whole series of activity were started then, including, for example, the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which is looking into what went wrong that evening and much more widely. But from a policy perspective, the most influential activity that has probably taken place has been the Dame Hackett report into the review of building regulations and fire safety. And it's kind of her conclusions of the report that have been the driver, and her recommendations that have been feeding and shaping this draft building safety bill. And really what she was talking about was that clear model of accountability and clear responsibility for building safety throughout the life cycle of a building. And for her, that culminated in this new statutory role of the building safety manager. Another key area for her was this golden thread of information that was already mentioned, because so often information within the occupation phase is lacking or it's inaccurate. And therefore, her big drive was to really make an impact in this particular area, including the driving of digital standards, respectively. And another two big area of focus more is the culture change and the competence across the built environment of anyone working on higher risk residential buildings and beyond in the future, and enabling residents to play a bigger role in this particular area. So there's quite a lot that's been going on. Last year in June, July, we got a little bit more of detail of how the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government was thinking of going with the regime. And in October 2019, Sir Martin Moore-Brick published his first phase report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and that also included quite a lot of recommendations for building owners to take forward. There were also some new measures that were announced in January 2020, including more detailed building advice, and I'll touch on that later, where the ministry really wanted to move forward on stepping up, including on some of the mitigation on buildings that needed to take place. Now, the draft building safety bill was finally published in July 2020, and I think one of the big issues with it has been that it's quite a big bill, and it doesn't really contain much more than some of the high-level principles. So the coming months are still going to be really important in helping to flesh out a lot of the detail on how the regime should work on the ground. And already a call to action for listeners: if you've got any thoughts or questions, queries, first of all, we'll have the Q&A session later, but please feed them through to us so that we can liaise with the ministry to make sure that the bill will work on the ground in future. And you might also be aware that there is a pre-legislative scrutiny taking place already. The Select Committee in Parliament, the Communities Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, is reviewing the draft bill, and we've submitted evidence to that. Now, on this particular slide, we're making reference to that Life Safety Working Group and the WG8 Secretariat, Working Group 8 Secretariat, because ever since the tragedy in June 2017, we brought together a number of IWFM members, the experts that have helped us to articulate a response to all these developments that have been going on. And as I already mentioned, Dame Hackett outlined in her report in May 2018 already that there needed to be a new role, the building safety manager, but also that that new role needed to meet new competence criteria. And that really led to a challenge for wider industry, who came together to form different working groups to look at competences for different roles in the built environment. And us at IWFM and the Life Safety Working Group have fed into that work. And indeed, we provided the secretariat for that. And that's how I also had the pleasure of meeting Adam, who's been on that working group for the last 24 months or so. Right, moving on to the next slide. There's an awful lot of activity, and we just quickly wanted to outline kind of what we've been doing. And I've already mentioned the Life Safety Group, and to remind people again of why we are doing all of this activity. And as I already touched on it, firstly, this legislation will lead to the first statutory role in the FM sphere. So it's really important for us as the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management to engage with that and help shape what that looks like for the profession. Secondly, whilst initially the legislation is focused on multi-occupancy residential higher risk buildings, that's not where this regime is going to stop. Already this includes student accommodation, but a kind of next phase that's anticipated is that the regime will be expanded to include hospitals, care homes, prisons, etc. And actually, if you look through the draft bill and the explanatory notes, there's already provision in there to expand the regime, perhaps not all the different components, but expand the regime to offices and workplaces. So it's very important to be engaged at this point in time already, because it's very likely to touch on every building in the future. And really, the third reason for putting in all this different activity is that it will just impact on so many different levels: the information and gathering and maintaining it, the drive for digital building information systems, and the drive for competence and culture change. And pivotal here has been the work of the Life Safety Working Group, and they've really fed into different things like the shaping of the draft building safety bill, helping to formulate our response to the pre-legislative scrutiny, helping with awareness raising about our activities, helping to provide news items, helping to do webinars like these. We've provided some agile guidance on how members can anticipate and prepare for this system. We've fed into consultation responses. One of our latest pieces of work is that we're pulling all of the information together, and pretty shortly in the next week or so, we will be launching a fire safety hub, which will basically outline all this different context and give members a lot of information, but all brought together in one place. Setting the bar and safer people, safer homes, building safety management, those are two reports which have only been published on Monday. I will talk about them a little bit later, and you can find them on the website as well, and definitely in the future. Fire Safety Hub, very much been engaged with that, and that's been a big part of our work over the last 24 months. And Working Group 8 and Working Group 9 and 10 on site supervisors and project managers have been a large part of that. Kind of the one activity I haven't necessarily touched upon is the British Standard 8644. We're working on that now, and it's focusing on digital management of fire safety information, and that will be used as guidance in the future to really what's the information you should really be collecting and how can you maintain it throughout the life cycle of the building and in a digital format. Right. Oops, sorry. Draft Building Safety Bill outline. So the bill really contains 5 sections and additional schedules. Key for the occupation phase are really part 2 and part 4. Part 2 outlines really what the role of the building safety regulator is, their powers, because quite a lot of the duties that are either falling to the building safety manager or the accountable person, there are very high sanctions on it, and many of them are criminal sanctions. Enforcement obviously needs to play a big role. There's also a lot of requirements and work that's being done on the retention and the proving and the evidencing of that building information. Part 4 really outlines the different duties and accountabilities and obligations for the accountable persons and the BSM, and all the different duties around gathering of information and resident engagement, and also things like building safety fees. How do you collect them? What can you charge them for? So what we're really seeing reflected in this draft building safety bill are the different strands of Hackett's report: the stronger resident voice, the clear system of accountability, although we still have got some queries around the functioning of some of that, the enforcement and sanctions, regime, the requirements around competence, including those in occupation, and that golden thread of information. For the regulator, there's kind of three key areas that they're responsible for. The first one being the obvious one, building safety, and that's around focusing on the safety of people, on risks arising from buildings. And that's just a section that's responsible for higher risk residential buildings at this point in time. But the duty to keep safety and standards of all buildings on the review is for a much wider scope of buildings, and it's due to be all buildings. And then the third role of the regulator is really to engage with that driving up of the competence of the wider industry, the trades and the professions, and building inspectors. It contains quite a lot of provisions around that. The reason why there's the three strands there is because this is really meant to provide clarity on the entirety of the life cycle. So the sections are focused on design and construction and then occupations. And I think most people will be aware by now that it's the Health and Safety Executive that will house the Building Safety Regulator. And one of the areas is there's quite a lot of committees that the regulator will host to ensure that the system is really responsive to the needs of its environment. And first of that is that Building Advisory Committee, which will, amongst others, focus on whether the right type of risks are included, whether the right types of buildings are included. The second important committee is that Committee on Industry Competence, because they will, of course, ensure and help to drive the standards. And then to ensure that we've got residents really truly at the heart of the regime, there is a residents panel that is engaged with quite a lot of the activity. The residents panel, for example, is consulted before the regulator submits their strategic plan to the Secretary of State for approval of how they're going to implement the regime. They're consulted when guidance will be issued by the regulator. They will have focus groups. They will advise on how a mandatory reporting system should be set up, etc. So really, the intention of the government is to put residents at the heart of this new regime. And then to really focus on the bit that's of interest for us, the scope of the bill in that occupation phase, there are two different elements to that scope, building safety risk and the higher risk building concept. And the building safety risk really focuses on those risks that are resulting from fire or structural failure. Both IWFM and WG8 have been arguing that really this scope should be extended, because just focusing narrowly on those two risks might mean that there are some gaps in the regimes, or there are some risks that might be overlooked if they're not included in this regime. So the risk that the duty holders will manage in the occupation phase via the safety case, so it will be the accountable person and the BSM, are those that prevent a major incident. So it says there what major incident is, and that is slightly a departure from before, and it's kind of the influence of the nuclear safety, nuclear industry safety regime. But what does it mean? Because it introduces some of these new concepts. And actually the examples used in the explanatory notes make reference to hazards, including, for example, hoarding, uncontrolled combustible materials in the common corridors, unchecked fire spread through voids and penetration, things like that, uncontrolled changes to front doors or flats. So those are some of the hazards that need to be looked at. When it comes to, so that's the whole risk concept. When it comes to the building and the higher risk buildings, really, what are those about? And then the main definition, the broad definition really is the risk of major incident higher than in buildings in general, and then you're a higher risk building. The buildings, for the regime to become applicable, must be occupied, and there are heights and purpose conditions which have been suggested to be the first phase of the regime. So the 18 meters or above, or 6 stories or above, which people will already be familiar with. But this includes student accommodation, and any future change to this will be done by regulations in futures when there is evidence that there's a need to really change this. So while there are some very clear high-level principles to outline the scope, this can all be amended in future depending on the changing needs by secondary legislation. Now, we're finally getting to the Building Safety Manager, or the BSM, as we've come to name this person. And quickly, before we go there, we should really touch on that accountable person and who they are. They're often the owner. However, the definition really makes reference to the repairing obligation, which in effect allows organisations such as managing agents or FM organisations to take on the role as well. One of the things that we've highlighted, of course, is that the accountable person, if you look at it in a very strict way, could very well be a hedge fund based in Singapore. To account for that and to try and counter that, this is where they've tried tweaking the definitions in relation to the repairing obligation, so that there can be a clear, identifiable, accountable person here in the UK. The building safety manager needs to be appointed by the accountable person before the buildings become occupied, and the accountable person first goes through a registration where they basically indicate that they're taking on their responsibilities, and that process, and they make themselves identifiable to the regulator. And that, in essence, triggers then the duty to the accountable person to appoint this building safety manager. And obviously, that role is going to be held by contractual arrangements. And what is really important to understand is that when you read the legislation, many of the duties in the occupation phase are pointing at the accountable person. But in reality, and the explanatory note of the bill are very clear about this, in reality, the BSM will carry out the day-to-day functions. So who can this role be fulfilled by? It's both an organisation or a person, but if you've got an organisation, then you need to have a clear nominated individual in place. The bill extends some requirements around competence, the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours, the SKEBs. And of course, as an organisation, or even if an individual does it as just an individual BSM, then you need to demonstrate that you've got the organisational capability to deliver against the functions. Because of the way that the accountable person first has to register and then apply for a building assurance certificate, it effectively gives the regulator a veto on the appointment of the building safety manager. So if they're finding that this BSM is not satisfactory, then they can veto the appointment. And that would actually mean that for new buildings that are being built, no occupation can take place until a building safety manager is in place. And the BSM can be removed. They can leave the role themselves, the accountable person can dismiss them, but also the regulator can trigger this. Just to give a bit more clarity, there are 3 BSM functions. They must manage the building in accordance with the safety case, and we'll go on to that next. They need to operate a mandatory occurrence reporting system and implement an engagement strategy. And this really goes to the core of some of the culture change that this regime is trying to achieve. Basically, it's trying to document a lot of the decision making and provide an evidence base that can be checked by the regulator. The mandatory occurrence reporting system makes sure that that just or no blame culture is achieved, and that they are trying to achieve that by making sure that through the mandatory occurrence reporting scheme, when the BSM reports something, that can't be used against them in any follow-up through the enforcement. And then implement the resident engagement strategy is all about ensuring that the residents are really truly the centre of any building's safety strategy. Key, of course, mentioned a few times, the golden thread of prescribed information. Now, I think it's important to outline that there's a difference between the wider safety case and the safety case report. The wider safety case is the totality of the building safety information and includes all the evidence that supports how building safety risks are being managed, and that's contained within that golden thread of information. And there are some duties, wider duties relating to that, and they're listed right there. Mostly they're focused at the accountable person, but as we've already said, it's the BSM that will do the role. And then we've got the safety case report, and really that's that summary which makes the claim of and an argument for safety, which has to be submitted to the regulator. And it addresses that exam question: can you identify the building safety risks in your building and show me how you manage these on an ongoing basis? And that new safety case regime is therefore the main way really that the regulator will hold the accountable person, and by delegation the building safety manager, to account for all the risks and how they are managed within that building. Quickly going over residents and their duties. The resident engagement strategy is a duty to deliver, both by the accountable person, and the BSM really needs to engage with this as well. And that's really to ensure that residents can engage with any decision that needs to be made on building safety measures. There is a whole series of automated information that needs to be given to residents, but residents can also ask for additional information. And just to make sure that residents are really being listened to, there is a complaints procedure that can be escalated. And so complaints can be raised to the BSM, and if they're not being resolved properly, then either the BSM or even the resident can escalate them to the regulator. Of course, with some beneficiaries, there's also some duties, and there are a key number of duties that the residents need to meet, including keeping relevant residence items in repair and proper working order. That's about gas and electricity systems. They can't really damage the relevant safety items, and those are those items in common parts, for example, any signage, etc. And they need to be able to provide access to dwelling when the accountable person or the BSM requests this in written permission with a written request. And we understand, of course, that this doesn't always happen, and therefore there is an ongoing escalation route to county court to deal with this. There's quite a few next steps that are happening, and what I've done here is just list those that are relating to the competence framework. They are the ones in red. So a number of competences will be required of the BSM, and that is something that the BSI, British Standards Institute, is working on, and we're feeding into this. work will start in earnest, and what they'll do effectively is incorporate the WG8 work into a publicly available standard, and that work will start in earnest in March 2021 and is due to be finished in 2022. This is a draft bill, and we're not expecting the draft bill to the actual bill to go to Parliament and to become an act until late 2021, really. So we're really looking at an implementation of this regime, kind of best guess at this point, by 2024. And all of this time, the Life Safety Working Group and the WG8 Secretariat will continue to work on this. We've talked about the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours that will be required for the building safety manager, and how is that going to find itself implemented so that our members, for example, can become and carry out the role of the BSM. So Working Group 8 outlined the different skills, etc., the competence requirements that we've needed, and that will be translated in that PAS. And then what we envisage is that people will either just be able to take an assessment to demonstrate all these different areas and behaviours, that they are meeting that, so they can then demonstrate to the accountable person, and by extension to the regulator, that they've got the skills, knowledge and experience and behaviours to carry out that BSM provision. And the report, Setting the Bar and Safer People, Safer Homes, Building Safety Managers, really talk about that in much greater detail. So I would encourage everyone to have a look at those reports, because that gives you a much clearer idea of what is expected of that building safety manager and what our members will need to meet as criteria to work on higher risk residential buildings. What can you do to prepare? There are kind of three key areas that your business plans really need to tackle. There's the buildings element. Will it fall into scope? Are you doing all the remediation that you should be doing at this point in time? On the people side, do you have the right people in the right place? Do they have the right competences? Do they need upskilling, etc., etc.? And then on the information and systems, there's going to be quite a demand, as we've seen, being put on what information you should be keeping and how you will store that, because that will be your evidence base to the regulator to demonstrate that you are managing this building according to the duties outlined. So you need to make sure that your safety case is in order. You've got the golden thread, and one of the requirements is that you will have a premises information box. So you really need to stay up to date, and therefore I'd encourage people to go to the website because some of these articles have been written up in much greater detail. And briefly, before we go to the panel, these are some of the specific building safety measures that people can already take. There's 2 reports there that are available on our website as well that outline some of these key areas that should be considered, whether it's around fire risk assessment, etc. Keeping the details of, keep fire service informed of relevant information and changes, including details of external walls and materials, etc., etc. All of that information is available on our website, and the slides will be available afterwards as well. So I would like, before we go and open the discussion much more broadly, I'd like to invite the panel to give their perspective on 3 specific areas. Those where the main impacts of these new regimes are, what is your biggest concern about the regime, and what are you already doing for your organisation to prepare? And Wayne, I can see you've appeared, so you may as well go first.
Thanks, Sophie. For everybody, as you can see, it's quite a substantial piece of legislation, and it will have probably a major impact, certainly with this building group, on what you have to do to maintain those and to deliver against this scheme. And I think the main impact I see for our profession, and certainly for the majority of our profession, it's on existing buildings, but is what is the requirement for competence, and how do you maintain that, and then where do you get that from? So this industry and every other part of the industry are now, certainly the trade bodies and the professional organisations are now looking at what does it mean to be competent in your role. So if you're looking at a building safety manager, what does it look to be competent in that role, and how do you upskill yourself in that role to give assurance to your employer or your organisation that you are capable to meet the requirements of the scheme and maintain their approval to operate those buildings. It's probably a different kind of scheme to what most people within the sort of management side of the industry are used to, in that there's a requirement to both register yourself and maintain your registration, and register the buildings and maintain its registration. And I think the key thing is that you need to fully understand your building into it, and this is where I think the big gap is what's happened to that building since it was constructed. And when it was constructed, it went through a thorough vetting process to ensure it was safe and secure and did what it was supposed to do. And it's those gaps in knowledge that I think are my key concern. It's the biggest impact that certainly I'm going through at the moment, in terms of where are those gaps and how do I collect that information, and then what's the cost. In terms, there's a huge lack of information. I've got a number of schemes on the go where they would touch into this scheme if they were getting done in 4 years' time, but we're trying to implement the requirements now for what may be, that process of the building safety bill, and the 30 years plus old, and we obviously don't have anything digital. We don't know invariably what's been done past 15 years, other than we then have to survey and find out. But in instances, we're looking at some of what would have been the original building safety case and thinking, how on earth did they get away with that when they designed this building? Because a lot of them have been developed through local authority control and may not have been through appropriate design and building regulations process, and we're finding lots of gaps, and to the extent that the bulk of them wouldn't comply with the building control regulations of the day. And it's trying to collate that information, look at the gaps, and put it into a process of what do we need to do to get these up to a compliance standard that we would be happy with now. There is a substantial cost to that, and I think all well and good, the bill going through, yes, there will be fees for registering the building and fees for registering people, and they'll be able to charge you if you're non-compliant, but they're a tiny proportion of the cost of this scheme. I think that when you start looking into what you may have to do to bring them up to a compliance standard, given that people can barely afford to do what's required now, it's a substantial cost. We've estimated that typically you're upwards of £40,000 just to get the golden thread information together. You're starting from where we would see a variable state of information that we have now, because you're going to have digital models. You're going to have to know everything about that building. You're going to have it surveyed to the compliance standards of the scheme. You're going to then have to implement all of the deficiencies or the non-compliant measures to bring it up to a standard to get it registered. Now, we're assuming that there's going to be a time delay between when the scheme starts to when existing buildings have to be shown to be compliant. But if you're looking at a typical block and you have to replace all the fire doors, do all the fire compartmentation, implement a system of fire mitigation works, and collect all the other information to make it compliant in the first place, you could be in the millions of pounds region to just get through that first compliance stage. We're finding that on our large scale regen projects, in that when we start looking at the fire remediation works, what you can see is all well and good. It's once you start cutting holes in the wall and find out fire stopping and fire compartmentation isn't where that's where all the costs start to lie. And I think they haven't quite looked into those ongoing costs yet. And then what does non-compliance mean? Does non-compliance mean you can't have people in that building? It probably does. When are they going to implement that? We don't know. And what's the risk to a business for that? Well, if you're a housing association and there's a block of flats with 300 dwellings in it and you can't occupy any of them, where are you going to put these people? Because nobody has 300 dwellings sitting there waiting for or on the potential that we're going to have to do something. So I think that's the risks that I see in terms of the implementation. And yes, everybody's gearing up towards having that knowledge now, but it's getting the money, to be honest, to deliver it, and getting buy-in from industry. Now, most housing associations already have that, buy-in. It's probably the private sector potentially where the risk will arise.
Wow,
so what we do?
A good introduction.
Oh, am I over time?
I'm trying to round it up. Yes, please, because you mentioned, the entire social housing perspective, and indeed, I think some of the implications are possibly quite different for the private housing sector. So I'd like to bring in Adam off for this.
Adam? Okay, no problem.
Sure, thank you, Sophie. And I think Wayne's articulated some of the challenges around the kind of physical aspects of buildings and getting them up to compliance there really well. And I wanted just to start by reflecting a little bit on the sort of journey I've been on. So when I joined Working Group 8, looking at the Building Safety Manager competency a couple of years ago, as a group, we were asked, first of all, to forget about what's been in the past and to ignore financial impact. And the purpose of that, I think, was really to remove restraints from our thinking, but it was also about saying this is going to be a step change for the industry. So there is going to be real change coming down the line that we are going to have to adapt to. Now we see the draft bill actually coming out and seeing the outcome of all this work, our feet are firmly back on the ground again. So we're now having to think about the commerciality of what some of these proposals actually are. Just very quickly, just explaining the world that I work in, and our structure is not necessarily a traditional structure for residential management. We've actually split our functions within our business. So we have, while we're performing a managing agent function, we have what we call an asset manager who's employed by our parent company, Knight Frank, who acts as the client representative. They're managing financial aspects, long-term planning, tenant liaison, and so forth. We then have within our Promise business, our facilities management business, a facilities manager or a building manager who is then on site. They're overseeing those operations, and we're managing the on-site staff, and we're overseeing statutory compliance. So it's more typical of a kind of commercial model that we're operating on residential, but collectively we're fulfilling the role of managing agent, and that, I think, introduces some opportunities for us and also some challenges as we move things forward. So when we look at what a managing agent is there to do, we're there as a collective to be the point of contact for the residents for and on behalf of our clients. And when we introduce the building safety manager into this and the accountable person duties, we have to think about how they're going to be fulfilled. So Promise as the FM provider can provide the building safety manager function, but our client is still going to expect that we are there to help them fulfill other duties that they now have as an accountable person and advise them about ramifications of this. So, and Sophie mentioned earlier that if this is an investment fund, for example, they're going to be very remote from the management of the building. So there is going to be a lot of reliance on us to actually implement these regulatory requirements, which is things like implementing the resident engagement strategy, managing complaints processes, providing information, developing safety case reports ourselves. We can't necessarily rely on our clients to do this. They are going to turn to us for that requirement. It sounds intimidating, but as a business, we're not intimidated by that because we feel that is what we are there to do, and that's how we want to support our clients. In fact, we've actually looked at it and said, well, if the client chooses to introduce a third party as a building safety manager, that is actually going to cause us quite a lot of problems because it's undermining the value of what we're bringing. We want to be that one-stop shop for our clients. That's not necessarily what every organisation wants to do, but for us, that's very important. There is, however, a lot of risk that comes with that. So the different areas of risk are things like the financial. So what are we now going to have to provide at an additional level for perhaps a fixed fee? What liabilities are we taking on in terms of both criminal liability under the new regulations and the new act as a building safety manager? Or if we throw the responsible person role into this and think about the fire safety order, does that add additional duties on us where we are agent but not necessarily a role under this new regulation? Insurance liabilities are really difficult. We're seeing a lot of pressure from insurers, and I'm sure a lot of others are, around the premiums and the limitations on insurance. And if we want to be able to perform these roles in the future, we have to manage that very carefully because that can become very costly. And there is also conflict. So the BSM role is meant to be able to report directly to the accountable person. How can we do that if we are also effectively performing the accountable person role. Does this mean that our building or facilities manager effectively has to go around our asset manager to the client, and that where we have conflict? And if we do have that, can that jeopardize our entire contract? So within our structure, we have to think very carefully about how we do that. Our structure, in a sense, gives us some advantage because we can separate out these functions, but we operate as one contract. So what one party does will directly affect the other. And if we have that conflict carrying through to our clients, then ultimately we are going to lose our contract overall. So we need to manage that internally. And then that then leads us to thinking about, well, who actually do we appoint as a building safety manager? Is it we have to have a named individual, even if we're going to take it on as an organisation. But in our structure, we have to make sure that those individuals have the right support, so that we have those people who are on the ground who are doing these functions, but then they have that management connection as well, and that network that they can support. I believe, from looking at the original report from Judith Hackett, Building a Safer Future, and to actually give the right level of service to our residents, that the building safety manager in a particularly complex block has to be someone in that building. They have to be very in touch with that building. They can't be faceless. So they have to be on the ground. And that means a lot of upskilling going forward. If you take the role too high in your organisation, I think it doesn't add what the original intent was. And then you're not going to deliver the right service for our residents ultimately. So that's looking at a bit of a step change there. And there is a lot of upskilling that comes with that, which I think is quite a challenge. So I think you can see we've got a lot of practical challenges there to take forward.
Thank you, Adam.
You wanted to stop me?
Yes, sorry. We've got quite a few questions coming in as well, and there were a few things I wanted to touch on with both of you, because you both have kind of touched on that accountable person and BSM relationship. Do you think that the bill properly reflects that relationship between those two roles? Does anyone want to take that question?
Well, I'm happy to start on it. I suppose I've touched on it already. I think I don't think it does look at it in reality. I think there is a real question around competency for accountable people. You have some people who are landlords who are very involved in their buildings and have a lot of skill set. You have others that just don't. And so there is a real gap there. I think a good model is the CDM regulations, where you have responsibilities for all parties to make sure that everyone knows their duties. And I think that is perhaps the gap that needs to be bridged to make this work in reality. But there definitely are gaps there at the moment.
Wayne, do you want to come in?
I would add, I'd add that there's potential for the appointed person to risk or to try and risk transfer some of his liabilities to the BSM, and I think they need to look at that a bit further to how that's implemented in the market, and how the insurance industry is going to have to look at that, to how that's dealt with on liability, because the way it's currently written, there is a huge liability attached to both roles, and it's whether people can get insurance to cover themselves, especially if they're third party, managing agents. It'd be interesting to see how the insurance goes on that. But even if it's in house, it's what's the liability attached to that person, because it is substantial. You have responsibility for that building, and you have responsibility for the people within that building to a much greater extent than you currently have.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the whole issue around the accountable person and the lack of competences, I don't think that's something that will be resolved. We've had a question come in, and it's a very short one. Will this bill cover all of the jurisdictions of the UK? I think that's a fairly straightforward one. It will focus on England, and then Wales is likely to take over the regime as well and apply it, much like England. We've had an interesting question come in around, sorry, just trying to find it, around would the IWFM expect a workplace manager to undertake a similar role and have similar competences for commercial premises? Is anyone up for grabs for that one?
Could you, so what was the question? Would the building safety manager have a similar role to a workplace manager?
Would a workplace manager to undertake, would there be an expectation for them to undertake a similar role and have similar competences for commercial premises? And I guess what this translates as is if when the scope of the legislation extends to commercial premises.
If it's buildings or the private sector, buildings, it will, if it's residential buildings, but whether it extends to commercial buildings in its current form, I suppose it depends if there's commercial and residential in the same block. There's certainly a requirement to discuss and review procedures, but I don't think it will, unless it's residential. It certainly, in its current format, it is for residential buildings. So, and I'm assuming commercial buildings means hospitals and other building types. I think they're looking at it, but I think the market's got to be able to deliver something. And if you put everything in to implementation straight away, it will just never happen because there's so many people upskill.
Yes, and I think just to elaborate on that, it will be a very interesting one because the explanatory notes in the bills already foresee some flexibility that not necessarily all the different elements of the regime will need to be applied. And therefore, it might just be that this workplace manager, if they're getting the title of building safety manager as well, or if those duties fall within the scope, then they need to meet those competences, but they might not necessarily need to apply those areas that relate to residents' engagement, for example. There's a brief questions on whether there will be amendments to the CDM regs.
There will have to be honest, because it's ultimately the competence for professionals who are designing buildings is being looked at as well. So whilst we're focusing on the building safety manager, there is going to be a requirement for every professional who works on these building types or the buildings that within scope to be competent. And within CDM, you're going to have to be competent to work on these buildings, which means you'll need to have a additional part to your registration if you're an architect to say you can also work on this building type. So CDM will have to take that into account. Now, it may well be that it'll just be a one-liner which says ensure that you're competent to work on those buildings, but ultimately somebody, a third party, whether it's the appointed person, is going to have to ensure that everybody working on this building type, whether it's architects, engineers, building safety or whoever, is a competent and registered to work on this building type. So it's CDM applicable for the design side and the management of those buildings, so they'll have to put something in to say and comply with that scheme.
I would add to that that there has been a lot that's been looking at the accountability of key roles. So things like the principal designer and what they're actually signing off on and what that accountability means. So there's a lot of talk in the bill about a gateway process that we haven't really gone into today, and about sign-offs on each of those gateway steps, and where the principal designer and principal contractor come into that. Is a big question, and there is a sort of desire that there is someone that actually officially signs off the design as built, and there has been told that would be the principal designer. So that's certainly not a definite thing, but there is that sort of desire that you have much clearer accountability, so that if in the future things are found to be wrong, that it's very clear who you can go back to identify what went wrong and why, and then that can be put right.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
Just to add to that, Sophie, sorry, just to add to that, there will also be a requirement for the building safety manager to ensure that if it's obviously the building's been handed to you and you're getting any work done, to ensure that anybody you get working on that building has themselves has the competency to do that, is registered.
You're quite right. And I think that's one of the big challenges, because ultimately at this point in time there are only really competence requirements to the building safety manager and the principal designer and the principal contractor. Now we see that the regulator is indeed responsible for kind of driving competence across the built environment, and indeed setting the bar. The report, which was launched on Monday, is also looking at competences for other trades and professionals. But how, I think, Adam, it would be useful to have your thoughts on that. How quickly do you think, or where do you think you're going to get some of these competent people from? Because you've already touched on that. Kind of where's that role of the BSM then coming from?
So we see that coming really from our existing building managers. We've done some early analysis on this, and we do feel that the majority of them will need some sort of upskilling, because they just don't have that technical fire safety knowledge that it will need. We will still have a lot of reliance on third parties, so fire engineers, fire risk assessors and so forth, but we do see there's a lot of upskilling there. And the balance with that is also thinking about things like, well, what happens when we take on a new property? Is that person at the standard we need them? How do we backfill that? How do we cover holiday? What happens when there are disputes? So it's not just at that ground level as well. So we see that at our management levels right up to director level, we are going to need to find that competency as well. So I think that's quite a long journey we've got to go on over the next year or so to deliver that as well.
Great. I can see that we're already reaching the time. This is going a little bit faster than I imagined it would. So I'm going to thank the public for all of your questions. I realise we haven't answered all of them, but we will do our best to respond to them afterwards, so people should be getting a response to the questions that they've asked. Adam, Wayne, is there anything that you really would like to add to what you've said? And I'm going to give the floor to Adam first.
Thanks, Sophie. I mean, I think there are, as I said, there's a lot of practical challenges about this, but my view is that we have to remember that all of this is actually about making the industry better. It's about making buildings safer for people. And I think when I think back to where we started with WG8, that was really a message that was coming out. So it's not going to be straightforward. There is a lot we still need to know. There are lots of gaps in our understanding of what's going to come forward. But we have to look at what the benefit of this is going to be for the industry as a whole. And I think if we work and we get this right, then we are going to see the improvements in buildings that we really need to see over time.
Okay, Wayne?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to start to prepare. It's not going to go away, this one. It may tweak it slightly before it comes out in formal legislation, but I think if you're a building portfolio owner, or just one of the buildings comes into scope, is start to prepare now. Start collecting that information, so that you're on your way to compliance by having, what is the golden thread, making sure you've got information in a format, but understand the gaps. And I think the first thing you should do is schedule out which buildings are likely to come under the scheme, and then start looking at, well, where are the gaps in our knowledge about that building, and where are we likely to have to invest to ensure that they will be compliant from the outset, rather than putting them in and then finding out you've got a whole pile of work to do to bring them up to standard, and then you might only get a year to do it. So I think in terms of the implementation of the scheme, they are still talking about how quickly it's going to be implemented and what information is going to be required. But ultimately, you need to fully understand that building's safe, and you're going to be required to register that building and get a certificate of occupation at the end of it, and you've got to maintain that certificate. So understand what you've got and where the risks are now.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. That's really useful. I think there are still quite a few uncertainties around, because ultimately this draft bill is only scheduling kind of some high level perspectives on it, and quite a lot of the duties and obligations will really be outlined and how they will practically work through secondary legislation. Thank you very much for being with us today. I just wanted to kind of outline some of the key messages that we want people to take away from today. This new regime is coming, and even though it might only be high level at this point in time, a lot of work is being undertaken to already try and give a little bit more detail. and it will very much impact our profession and wider sector, especially we're acting as managing agent or providing fire safety assurance or managing buildings in scope, such as student accommodation right now. But other building types, even though it would not necessarily be the first few years, other building types will be included, such as prisons, hospitals, etc. And we would really try and make sure that everyone on this webinar is taking the time that might take to look at upskilling and any other preparations that might need to be done. So this BSM role will absolutely be critical for the delivery of safety in buildings, and anyone needing to do that will need to be able to demonstrate the skills. And the WG8 report that was published on Monday gives a little bit more information on what the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours are that will be demanded, and the whole PASS system, the publicly available specification, which will be referenced in future statutory guidance, will outline those requirements that people will need to meet. And so I'm kind of left with two calls for action, really. Anyone that wants to contribute further to the work that we're doing, please get in touch with us. Our email address will show up on one of the next slides. And then also for a call for next week, please visit our Fire Safety Hub, which will be launched so that you can engage with this topic further and prepare for the implementation of the regime. And that leaves me then to thank both of our guests. I wish I could have given both of you a lot more time because your insights are really valuable to all of us. So thank you, Adam and Wayne, for this discussion. And thank you, listeners, for attending. And a recording will be available for anyone who wants to listen again or share with a friend. So thank you all. And hopefully until the next episode.